this is a close-up of an example in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This one, it might be harder to see the image, but it also contains a menorah on it. And in this slide, I've also pointed out one of the interesting things about these, that they're oftentimes interpreted as pilgrimage objects because they are understood to refer to Jerusalem in their symbols. However, the examples from known archaeological contexts come from burials, which is where they, at least in their lives, so an interesting aspect of those. So they're looking at those. The other type of object that we'll look at closely in the first half of the talk are these types of small tokens. So in this case, you can see one of the images has a scale. So in this case, it's 4 millimeters, which is actually on the large end of one of these. So they're between 2 and 4 millimeters, so really small. So if you're thinking about the economics of these would probably be among your least expensive kinds of pilgrimage souvenirs. These examples we're actually going to come back to, and these are the types of things that were excavated at Beit Shan. So we have the glasses we'll focus on, the tokens that we'll focus on, and some other types that are floating around as well. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the methodology for my study more generally, as well as what we're going to be talking about today. So in the background of this is a souvenir database. And in this, I've been assisted by a graduate assistant from the Department of History, Tanya Safransky. So we created a large database with hundreds of these objects, along with information like where they were excavated, how big they are, things like that. We also have their geographic provenance, in other words, where they came from, where they are, where they've been. And with that information, have been able to create maps using ArcGIS. So we take that information, put it in. You can then click on the little highlighted parts and find out what's there and so forth. What that also allows us to quickly visualize is where these objects are, where they were excavated, and so forth. And for example, the glass jars that we're going to look at today tend not to circulate outside of the Levant. So they're mostly concentrated around present-day Israel and the West Bank, parts of Jordan, sometimes parts of Lebanon. Whereas others, I think it decided I was done with that slide. Others circulate more widely. So since my computer wants me to go on, I'll go on. So the first case study we'll look at involves objects that were excavated at Beit Shan / Scythopolis. So Scythopolis is the name given to Beit Shan in the late Roman period. It is a site in that period that is wealthy, benefiting from trade. You can see in the map here with Scythopolis on the right-hand side, that it's kind of at the nexus of a number of different roads, coming from Caesarea towards the coast, going from north to south. So in this period, it's kind of a facilitator for travel, for commercial travel, as well as for pilgrims visiting a variety of holy sites. This is an image of Beit Shan as it is today, so Beit Shan / Scythopolis. In the background of this image, you can see the Tel, so Tel Beit Shan, which includes remains going back to the early Bronze Age down through the Iron Ages. In the Roman period, the Tel becomes the Acropolis of the city, so there's a temple to Zeus on top of it. In the Byzantine period, so 4th century and later, until the Islamic conquest, there's a church on top of it. So the temple to Zeus is replaced by a church, and this is kind of the signal of the kind of Christianization of the city. So we're going to look in the next slide at some of the shops at Beit Shan that were excavated in the 20th century. These are at the foot of the Tel. So in the maps here, you can see kind of the Tel. It's kind of hard for me to point things out the way the slide or the way the screen is set up. But if you're looking at the image here, you can see the blue box in the first map on the left, which shows where the shops are. Then you have a close-up of the shops in the next image. They're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Those are the shops that we're talking about. And in the next image, you can see the view from the Tel in the middle of Beit Shan, looking out towards the late Roman streets. And you can see the blue arrow indicates the location of the shops, and then a close-up inset photo showing the shops themselves. So the reason that these shops are important for us today is that they were destroyed in the 500s, and that destruction sealed the deposit from the shops and what they were selling and what they contained in that period. So after the destruction in the 500s, it's built over, sealing the context until it was excavated in the 20th century. When it was excavated in the 20th century, archaeologists found in shop number 1 these tokens. So these are tokens similar to the ones we looked at in the earlier slides. So in this case, you can see the scale indicating that they're about 2 millimeters. And I'll point out some of what these have. So on one side are the photos, on the other side are line drawings, which make the images a little bit easier to see. So if you're looking at the upper left, well, this might actually be kind of fun. Can anybody tell what that one is? Yeah, it is. It's actually it's Jesus, Mary, and the 3 magi. So I mean, it's one of the things I love about these is that you're talking about something that's super tiny, but they managed to get that image in there. So like, okay, 3 guys, 1 city. So you know, if you know what that kind of looks like, you know what it is there. So you've got Mary, kind of impression of baby Jesus, and then the 3 magi. The other one, if you're kind of going from left to right, is the baptism of Jesus. There are a couple of figures, and then there's a person coming out of the water. The larger one that is fragmentary likely depicts the wing of an angel, so maybe a visitation scene or something like that. The one in the lower left, this one's actually labeled in Greek. So good thing we have the Greek club viewing us via Zoom. So this one says Solomon, retrograde around it, and then it has a curious object in the middle. This has been interpreted in various ways. One prevailing interpretation is that it's a mandrake root. So perhaps a mandrake root. I actually think it might be something else, but it says Solomon on it. The reason it says Solomon is because of Solomon's associations with protective and curative towers in the period. So he's kind of this protective king to invoke. So we have Solomon in this case. So in some sense, these are remarkable. What is remarkable is both the place in which they were found, so in shops, likely being sold, and then this is one of the few cases in which petrographic analysis was done on the tokens themselves. So a materials analysis that was able to determine likely sources from which the clay came to make them. So what that showed was that the clay actually came from nearby. So in this case, from Mount Gilboa, so just outside of Beit Shan. So in other words, these didn't travel far from where they were made to make the shop at Beit Shan, where they could be sold to pilgrims coming through, likely en route to other places. So we go back to those for just a second. If we're looking at the story of Jesus and the Magi, if that's going to be associated with any place, it's probably Bethlehem. If you're thinking about baptism of Jesus, the Jordan River, Solomon, maybe Jerusalem. But none of those places are Beit Shan, and none of those places are Mount Gilboa. So what all of this indicates is that you have objects that refer to places outside of Beit Shan that could be sold to pilgrims coming through. And none of them were made in the places they refer to either. Now, that might seem like a minor point in an age when we kind of think of things being made all over the place. But most discussions of pilgrimage souvenirs assume that they're made at the site itself. So in other words, it's made at Bethlehem, and the person acquired it at Bethlehem and then took it home. The evidence from Beit Shan suggests otherwise. They could actually have different places that are making things, they can be sold in third places, and so forth. So it complicates our understanding of how those objects are sold, acquired, moved, and so forth. So some of the things that are interesting about the shops include what was found in the shops with the tokens. So along with the tokens, hundreds of lamps. If you're looking at the image on the screen, so we have the shops once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In the photograph on the screen, in the upper left, that's actually a magical amulet. It has a chicken-headed, snake-legged kind of being That in other examples of this is called Ya'al, which is probably the Greek rendering of the Hebrew tetragrammaton. So you have that being invoked on this amulet. There's a glass weight in the bottom center, and hundreds of coins. So why is that a big deal? Well, for me, this signals that these are shops that are not just interested in selling things to pilgrims. They have lots of things to sell. So they're selling lots of things. People might come through the shops in the middle of town. They're looking for a lamp, which maybe they'll offer at the church or something like that. But you can also get tokens and other things that you might use in daily life. So that, I think, makes it kind of an interesting case for what acquiring these kinds of objects in the Holy Land was like. But they didn't necessarily come from the place that they depicted, and that you're buying them in a commercial context where lots of other things are sold as well. So another case from Beit Shan. So leave the shops for a second. One thing I should mention too, one reason to think that they were for sale and not being used on the premises was that they had no indication that they'd been scraped off, and I'll get to that in a moment. And they were all baked hard, likely by the fire that destroyed the buildings. So one other place, or actually a couple other places where these were found in Beit Shan. One of them is a building just identified as the Mansion, which is on the outskirts of Beit Shan. It's not too far from the better-known house of Leontius, which is had been identified as a house belonging to a wealthy Jewish family at the time. So House of Leontius, not far is this building identified as the Mansion, excavated in mid-20th century. In the house, which you can see depicted here, excavators found these tokens. So these came from this kind of domestic context. These were not baked hard, and you can see kind of around the edges places where they seem to have been scraped off. And the reason that these are assumed to be scrapings rather than just breaks is kind of the nature of how it looks. It's also because there are literary sources describing one way that these could be used, and that's to take these things and scrape off some of the clay and put it into a drink or eat it, and then you get benefits from it. So it heals you in various ways. So these appear to have been used in that way, unlike the ones from the shop. I know some of you are aghast, but I don't know, I haven't tried it. But that's what we see here. And just to point out what some of these scenes are as well. So the one in the upper left is a little bit hard to see because it's worn. That is likely originally kind of Mary with Jesus in the middle, and then two angels on the side. The one in that top middle is women visiting the tomb, the empty tomb of Jesus in Jerusalem. Bottom left, that's probably Jesus on the water with two fishermen. And then the bottom middle is hard until you hear what it is, and then maybe it makes sense. This is probably the Ascension. So you can kind of see the being at the top. You can see a cross at the bottom, two angels in the upper part, and then there are just a bunch of lines at the bottom. And those are probably the figures that in traditional Ascension scenes are actually people looking up. But if you've only got a couple of millimeters, they're just lines. So that's probably what that was. The image at the upper right is one that's been interpreted in different ways. The original excavator interpreted as the encounter between Jesus and two others on the road to Emmaus, which is possible. It's also been interpreted as the Traditio Legis. That's an image with Jesus and Moses and Peter. I actually think it might depict the transfiguration at Mount Tabor. And the reason is that there are some debates among Christians in this period as to where the transfiguration took place because the gospel doesn't say. But one tradition that kind of solidifies in the 4th to 7th centuries is that it happened at Mount Tabor. One reason I think this could be that within the others is that it's located at a specific place. So for pilgrims, they like to visit places that are associated with a specific story, even if you're buying a token in Beit Shan. So I think it's likely that one. Now, a few others, these actually came out of salvage excavations around Beit Shan when the sewer line was going in. So you find interesting things with those kinds of excavations too. In this case, once again, we see Mary with the Magi visiting. And you can see on the right an image of the Dormition. So this is kind of Mary when she's kind of dying and so forth, and that's what's being depicted there. These have undergone a preliminary petrographic analysis, which suggests that the clay comes either from the Negev, part of the south, or in Transjordan. So neither one of these coming from Bethlehem or from Jerusalem either. So located in different places, finding their way into Beit Shan, not really associated with what we've seen. So to kind of walk you through these one more time, one of the ones I mentioned earlier that I think is likely the three figures in the Transfiguration associated with this period with Mount Tabor. The one from Beit Shan is on your left. Another one, this one I came across just looking through a catalog. So this one was published and is in the Princeton University Art Museum. Was purchased in Antioch, so presumably came from around there. The one on the far right, I actually just came across about a month ago. So this one actually comes from a somewhat obscure publication, which was a document from the 1920s publishing for the first time the metal amphitheater from Bobbio. Those are the ones I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture from Italy. So along with those kind of fancy metal ones, they included this photograph of a small token that they found there too. And it looks, as you can see, a lot like the other two. So whatever these are depicting, it seems to be the same scene. It's interesting for me because in this case you have one at Beit Shan, one in Antioch, one that made its way all the way to Italy, all referring, I think, probably to the Transfiguration at Mount Tabor. We'll actually come back to this at the end to see maybe what stories could have been associated with this particular object in different places. So we're going to leave Beit Shan for just a bit and look at those glass jars that I mentioned at the beginning. So in this image you can see kind of a variety of these different shapes. So these might look very different, but they're all made with the same kind of hexagonal mold. And then it's up to the glass blower what they do, whether to make it a kind of open top or give it a longer stem and that sort of thing. So that part's the same. You can see an example with the menorah in the top middle, as well as one in the bottom middle. It's just a better resolution photograph, and I wanted to give you a sense of the relative sizes. Occasionally things have gone too long. You can also see in the other examples, one that just has kind of geometric figures of natural shapes, another one that has a cross on it that might be a little bit hard to see. So the reason I wanted to put all these out there for you is that these are our main two types. One with natural forms, one with crosses and Christian symbols, one with menorahs and other Jewish symbols on it. The dating for these comes partly from archaeological context, partly from style and the way they depict certain things like the crosses. If you're looking at this example, you can see the similarity between the cross depicted here and the one on these two Byzantine coins. So one dated in the late 500s, one in the early 600s. So the idea is that that particular way of representing the cross comes about in those periods, and they're imitating it on these molds. Some other ways of kind of linking it to other aspects of, in this case, Christian art. You can see the cross with those steps, but also with those kind of flourishes on the end. That type appears towards the end of the 400s, and you can see an example of it at Santa Fidenziana in Rome. This one also, you can kind of see the mound underneath the cross, which is similar to what you see on those jars as well. So that's likely what they're trying to depict in a more schematic form. So we have the crosses, the menorahs. Some other things are a little bit harder to identify. So I wanted to bring up this example. So in this example of a mold-blown glass jar, you can see that there's kind of this point with a slant coming out of it. These have traditionally been interpreted as Simeon stylites, so it's the column and the ladder coming off the side. However, another scholar has argued that this is actually a representation of the standing caliph. So you can see the standing caliph coin in the image there, kind of there with the sword coming out on the side. One reason to think this might have something to it is that the reverse side of that same coin has that monument with the kind of straight line and the circle around it, which you can also see depicted on those same on that same type of glass jar. So it's possible that it was understood to be a standing caliph, along with other symbols from early Islamic Jerusalem. If that's the case, then you potentially have glass blowers, maybe in the same workshops, making things for a Christian market, a Jewish market, and potentially an early Islamic market as well. So, but I did want to give you the counter argument as well. So this is an image of a token with Simeon stylites. So you can kind of see the way in which that also is kind of this big, thick vertical line with a ladder coming off the side. So one of the difficulties is that if you're looking at kind of glasswares that are oftentimes made with slightly worn molds, it can be hard to see exactly what they're trying to depict. So some of those seem a little bit ambiguous to me, although I think the idea that it might be a standing caliph is certainly possible. One reason I wanted to bring that up is that studies of these often assume that the kind of creation and market of these things ends suddenly in the early Islamic period. If we do have some continuing to be made after that, then that kind of changes the way in which we're understanding the ways in which those are made and marketed. So these are further examples from different burial contexts. So you can see some from Percy, from a Christian burial context, some from Beit Shan, and then at the bottom right, an example from Beit Shireen. So this example is from a Jewish burial dating to kind of the end of the Byzantine, beginning of the Islamic period. So we actually find these in a variety of contexts as well. And here's some good photographs of some from a more recent excavation at Miami. So to give you an idea of the kind of variety that might come out of a single burial. So I feel like I might have been holding out on you a little bit with these in kind of coming to one of my larger points. So they do have a variety of different kinds of symbols, Jewish, Christian, potentially Islamic, some of them natural, so no religious imagery that's recognizable, just sort of geometric shapes. And they're oftentimes assumed to have been produced in Jerusalem. The reason for that assumption is the reference to Golgotha, potentially with the cross, the menorah, which seems to be a link to Jerusalem. And if it is a standing caliph, some of the early Islamic architecture and things like that connected to Jerusalem. However, none of these have been found in Jerusalem. They all come from areas you can see mapped out here. And there's one mold for making these that's been excavated, and that comes from Samaria. So the city of Samaria, excavated in the 1930s. And you can see an image of that mold right here. So in this case, you have objects that might come out of the same workshop, depending on what mold you use, referring to a variety of symbols associated with divergent religious traditions in the Holy Land, maybe not made at Jerusalem at all. So to kind of bring these two different things together, we've seen in the example from Beit Shan that you have objects that can be made one place, sold someplace else, sourced from material made elsewhere, and then brought home to another location to go with your story of your travels to the Holy Land. In the examples of glasswares, we might assume that it's maybe Jewish glassmakers making them for a Jewish market, but the evidence suggests that it could be otherwise. They could actually have one workshop making them for multiple markets and so forth, which complicates our picture of what this actually looks like. It also acknowledges the kind of economic motivations behind pilgrimage as well, which is something that a lot of scholars are reluctant to talk about. So to kind of bring some of this maybe towards a conclusion, I wanted to go back to our definitions of souvenir once again. So to take color, the first one here, I think the reproduction of images we've seen marks certain places as the marks certain places as the reference point for these. So I think it kind of fits with what color is doing. If we go to Annabelle Jane Witten, in this case, a souvenir functions as a mnemonic device, personal repository of special memory. It realizes its purpose through dislocation. I think we have seen the ways in which these can move away from the places that, if they weren't purchased there, at least they visually reference in some way. I think Stewart's is a little bit more complicated. The idea that the souvenir is destined to be forgotten and that its tragedy lies in the depth of memory. And in part because the individual stories associated with acquisition can't be recovered. However, I think in some ways, in looking at examples from known archaeological contexts, we can recover at least a plausible story. And I want to skip back actually a few slides to our examples from Beit Shan, to these right here. So if we're looking at these, they are different tokens, but they represent the same image. So if we're looking at the shop at Beit Shan, we can kind of reconstruct a scenario in which a pilgrim coming through acquires a token like this. Maybe they take it to Antioch, and even if they didn't visit Mount Tabor, they're close by, and it refers to it. And maybe they take it all the way to Babio, to a monastery there, where it's eventually interred with the remains of the founding saint, and remains there until it's excavated in the 20th century. In that case, even as the token is passed down, it serves several of these purposes we've seen in these definitions. It authenticates the site by referring to it. So even for those who never travel to the Holy Land, it makes the place real in that way. And it serves as tangible proof that even if you, as an individual in northern Italy, can't make it to the Holy Land, you know it's there, and maybe you can hold just a little piece of it in your grasp. And we'll leave it there.
You have field your own questions, I'm sure.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Okay.
So I like your talk reminds me of another talk which occurred in the seminar some years ago about the opposite situation, and from a later period, people reading graffiti. Is this period, 4th to 7th century, too long ago that we can't see graffiti?
Oh, no,
But
yeah.
whether the travelers left that as well as buying souvenirs, I wonder if you have some speculation.
Oh, yeah. So graffiti exists, and graffiti to pilgrimage sites goes all the way back into the Bronze Age. So there are sites in Egypt that have that, that date to much earlier than this. One of the stories we have from a pilgrimage account actually describes the graffiti. So it dates to about the same period as these objects. So this is the Piacenza pilgrim, who comes from an area around where Bobbio and Monza are, so that same area of northern Italy. And he describes going to the shrine associated with the wedding feast in Cana, which is a story of the beginning of the Gospel of John, where Jesus turns the water into wine. And he goes there, and interestingly, what he writes is not his own name. He writes the names of his parents, which is interesting too, because it sort of suggests that for him, his parents, and I don't remember if the text indicates that they're alive or not. I don't think it says, but presumably they're receiving some benefit back in Italy for having their names written at this church in the Holy Land. I also think it's interesting because oftentimes when we look at graffiti and names, we assume that it's the name of the person, which is what I always assume these days if I'm seeing graffiti. But in this case, we have literary testimony that someone wrote the names of someone else, assuming that they've received some benefit from having their name there. So, yeah, so I think it actually works in both ways. So the souvenir, I think it confirms the reality of the trip and the authenticity of the person who goes back. But I think graffiti in some ways is kind of making a kind of permanent mark that you were there, that it kind of confirms it in a kind of material way as well. So no, it's an interesting subject as well, graffiti and what people leave at the place. Oh, yeah.
I have a question about pilgrimage and the role of souvenirs engaging. So let me just take a second to say, it seems to me that in modern Jewish times, you have a fair amount of pilgrimage to the sites of the great sages. Certainly in modern Israel, this is, you go to Baba Sali or whatever, the great sages of the Sephardic tradition. But that's a different kind of pilgrimage than, say, the 3 pilgrimages laid out in the Bible. I would say one is more folk religion, one is more elite religion, or one is more normative and one is more pietist. I don't know, there's some sort of distinction to be made here. But my real question is, do these souvenirs tell you something about the role of the particular pilgrims or the importance of the pilgrimage in various eras and in various religions?
Yeah, I think you could, in cases where the souvenir is known to come from a specific place or depict a certain place, I think you probably could find or could speculate about a correlation between the kind of popularity of a place and its representation on certain objects. One challenge is that these are ones where we actually know what it represents. A whole class of souvenir involves what's sometimes called the piece of the rock souvenir, which is where you just go chip something off, or you pick up a pebble, or you have some sand, and you bring it home. And then the story with it is what's important. And maybe even if it passes down within a family, you know what it is. Or if you're cleaning up your, parents' things later, you're like, what is this rock? And where does it come from? But there are challenges to kind of putting together the story, with the object and so forth. Yeah, so I think it might be possible that there would always be a kind of some room for error in things that you just can't identify as souvenirs or something like that.
Have you noticed higher concentrations of souvenirs being found in nomadic populations versus stationary society?
No, I really haven't. One thing I will say is that, pilgrimage is something that's universal, so nomadic populations practice pilgrimage as well. But I think one of the challenges, but I think it's an interesting question, so it's like one of those things I'll probably keep my eyes open for, but I haven't seen anything yet. Nina, did you ever?
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. You mentioned you didn't want to, or scholars don't want to get into the economic question, but I'm going to go there and then just see what you can do with this. What can you say about the relative value of these, which may be answered by how many we found? If there's a few, one would think they're more valuable. There's not that many created, whereas the other situation where there's so many of them that they're not each one not worth very much. So I am curious, what is this a precious something, and how precious?
Yeah, I think there are several things.
That's the government is working. The government is not. This is not right. No, this is something else. This is something else. That's not for an hour.
Okay.
So yeah, Nina, to answer your question, I think there.
That was just to see if we're awake enough for the next one.
I think there are several ways to kind of get at that. In some cases where there are similar objects from one place, then I think you can look at the kind of range of things that are offered. One example I'm thinking of is from St. Nina's Shrine in Egypt. So from there are things that are kind of, I guess, nicer, bigger, smaller, that kind of thing. And it suggests that there's a range of options that are being offered. Similarly with things associated with Jerusalem, the pewter flasks from northern Italy would seem to be of greater value than the clay ones and things like that. One thing I will say, though, is that there is a value that's associated with kind of distance and scarcity. So even if you have one of the more kind of humble tokens, once it travels all the way, from Beit Shan to Italy or something like that, in that case, it's of sufficient value to be buried alongside with the pewter flasks and with the relics of the saint and so forth. But it does seem to be at the sites that there's kind of a range of options that are available, which suggests to me that they're being sold. One of the hard things about it is that the pilgrimage sources we have occasionally talk about buying things, but they don't they talk about buying souvenirs specifically, and that seems to be not so much that they don't want to, but it's not the focus of it. So they're kind of focused on what they did at the site or how it connects to a biblical passage or something like that. There's one passage where a wealthy traveler tries to buy a lion, like a tame lion that some nuns had, and they refuse to sell it to him. But that's one of the few occasions of somebody trying to buy something. In that case, he doesn't get it anyway. So yeah, so I think you can kind of infer from the range of things that are offered that there is a kind of economics to it. And I should say too, I mean, in the last 20 years, scholars have started to talk more about the economics of pilgrimage. And in the last 5 years, there have been some really good work done. But traditionally, scholarship on pilgrimage has talked more about the piety of the pilgrims, how they use the holy objects and things like that, and less about the economics involved. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a question about the images on the artifacts. So you can learn a lot about religion from this art, from the images.
Yeah.
For example, when did we start to see the cross? I'm curious about seeing Mary on this. What does the images or the image tell us about the development of the role of Mary in Christianity?
Yeah. I mean, all the ones we've seen are kind of post, I guess, consular ratification of Mary as the Theotokos. So that may be one reason. Yeah, so I think you can definitely say that she's among the more popular images to have. One thing that's interesting too, if we kind of go back to the image with Mary and the Magi, that's among the most popular images on these tokens. It appears, among other places at Ravenna on Theodora's robe. So there's a little image of Mary and the Magi there. It appears also in Ravenna in some of the Arian buildings are associated with kind of the Gothic themes that are taken over. So it's kind of popular throughout. There are some interesting questions as to why it's so popular for pilgrims. One idea that I think has something to it that is not mine is that the Magi might be stand-ins for pilgrims themselves. So in some ways, they're the travelers to Mary. And so if these are protective in any way, they protect the traveler like they protect the Magi or something.
So they're more important than Mary.
Maybe. Yeah.
Let's
Thanks, y'all.
let's the professor. Thank everybody for zooming in, and look forward to seeing you at the film festival, and look forward to seeing you next month for Mr. Reed Heller. Thank you.
Your talks are enjoyed. It's glad I skipped class.
Yes, that's what. For what it's worth, I totally thought that was the configuration as soon as it came on. This is like this one where I was like, yeah, I know what that is.